Okay, I would like to introduce our instructor for tonight, Shauna Holmes, who's going to teach us all about hand sewing.
Well, not quite all about because we've got limited time, but I am going to teach you the basic stitches. I'm in a video call, honey. So that's my son in the background. You're probably going to hear him a lot throughout the night. I apologize ahead of time. I've been sewing for almost 20 years now. I started doing medieval reenactment. Nothing fit me right, so I had to learn how to sew it. I didn't have a machine, so I did a lot of sewing by hand. And I learned from a lot of wonderful people, and then went to college for costuming. So I learned from a lot more wonderful people. So the first thing, you need your fabric. I've got some basic muslin strips here. You need where's the camera at? Right there. Sewing needle. You need thread. For hand sewing, I like to use, it's called further wax skein or silamide. And you usually have to go online to find this, but it's pre-waxed sewing thread. So you don't have to wax it. And if you look down here at the bottom, you can see where it comes bound around the bottom edge. All you have to do is snip it, and you have perfect length for hand sewing. So this is a wonderful thing for hand sewing. I highly recommend it. Gideon. Mama, no. Mama? Just a second, guys. I got to deal with my son. Sorry about that, guys. He's usually in bed by now, but it's been a weird night. And snips. I forgot my snips at the office. So if you forget your snips, you can just use regular scissors too. But snips are usually about yay long. You can find them in the embroidery section. You can find them with the scissors. They're just a lot easier cutting small things. So I have, let's put it down here, already threaded. There's a tail. And you want the tail to be about, I'd say that's probably about 5 inches or so. Sometimes you need a dark thread, sometimes you need a light thread. But it needs to be longer than the needle because you're going to kind of use that as a guide for when you need to tie off so that you don't run out of thread and can't tie off and finish your end. So the way that I knot these in period, there's some debate whether they were knotted or it was just a bunch of passes over each other. I like to knot, and sometimes I'll do a couple of passes on the counter. I like to do knot and a couple of passes depending on the fabric. The looser weave the fabric, the more likely a knot is going to come out. So it's just better to do like 4 or 5 passes over each other. And I'll show you what that looks like. So here I've got my muslin strip. Gideon, go to bed. I'm gonna brush my teeth. Then go brush your teeth. So you come up from the front or the back. If you're on the inside, it doesn't matter which side you go from. Just a note, I am left-handed. So I will be doing this for left-handed people. If you're right-handed, you just need to mirror me. Go back through, pull. Not right now, Gideon. You can do it yourself. You're a big boy. And because this is not a loose weave and I've knotted it, I don't need to do any more than 2 passes. But if you're not knotting it and it's a looser weave, I'd recommend about 4 or 5 passes like that. And then you're going to come back up through. So the first one we're going to do is called a basting stitch. It can also be used to gather. Basting stitches are basically, they're holding two pieces of fabric together that are super slippy until you can put in the final stitch. It also works if one is cut on the bias and stretches a lot. You just put a quick basting stitch in to keep it from stretching too much. So what you're going to do is you're going to come up through the back. You do not need to finish off the end on this because you're just going to take it out later. So you come down. Don't go all the way through. Just give a good ½ inch or so. Gather some on there. Pull it through. And it just looks like that. It's a pretty simple stitch. It's just for holding a couple pieces of fabric together until you can get the secure stitch in. Like I said, it's usually used for stretchy bias. Curly, Gideon. I'm sorry, guys. My son's usually in bed by now, so this normally isn't an issue. All right, so that's the basting stitch. Like I said, you can also use it for gathering. What you would do for a gather stitch is you would put it in like that, and then to gather it, you just pull. And you get a nice little ½ inch gather. And you use that when you're trying to control fullness. It's also the same kind of stitch you would use if you're going to be doing cartridge pleating, except with that you measure out and mark where the thread needs to go through. So it's the same thing for cartridge pleating. The next one we're going to show is a straight stitch, which is very similar. It's just a lot smaller. This one is not necessarily a very secure seam. You would not want any pressure put on it. Gideon, go to bed.
Mama.
What? Okay, he's going up to bed now, so hopefully that'll be the last distraction from him. So you want to go 1/8 of an inch, and you can do multiples like you do with the basting stitch. This is not going to be for secure, for seams that are under pressure. So you just do a couple and you pull it. And you got these nice little stitches. And again, in period, there's no real proof for how they finished off the end of the seam. So you can either pass them over like you did at the beginning or tie a knot. And I'll show you how I do the knot. So I go back 1 stitch. Pull it through, flip it to the other side, and I'm going to pass the needle under a previous stitch. Sorry. And then I'm going to wrap the thread around the needle about 5 times. And then I'm going to pull it down to where the needle and the thread that I passed it under meet. Use my finger to hold the threads in place, kind of, and pull. And there you've got a knot, and it will stay secure. The fabric's more likely to give out before the knot does. And you can either leave a little tail, clip it. If it's going to be something that's hidden, I like to do what's called bury the tail. You get in as close to the knot as you can. Pass the needle between the 2 layers of fabric. This is especially good if you're doing like lining. I should have. And you come out 1/2 inch to 1 inch away from the knot. Pull it a little tight so there's a little bit of a gap, and clip, and then smooth it so that the tail of the thread goes between your 2 layers. And that is a straight stitch. Next one is a more secure stitch. It's going to handle pressure better. It's called a back stitch. This is one you're going to use on like your side seams or your center front seams or anywhere that's going to be under stress. So you knot your thread, come up from behind, you're going to go for this first stitch, you're going to go a little bit longer than on the rest of your stitches. And then you're going to come back and the needle's going to come up about the halfway point of the stitch. You pull up, you go about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch ahead of the stitch that you just did, the end of the stitch, the first stitch, pull through. And now you have a guide for where you come up at. You're going to go just next to where you went in with the first stitch. Pull through and repeat. And this stitch is not going to be seen, so you don't really need to worry about which side of the thread you come up on. Some people are very particular that it must come up on the same side. I'm not very particular. It can come up on either side. And I'll show you what the other side looks like here in a second. I want to get a few stitches in. And unless you really need to make sure that that seam is not going to fail, you do not have to do every stitch in the line as a back stitch. You can go, sorry, you can go straight stitch for like 3 or 4 stitches, put in a back stitch, straight stitch for 3 or 4 stitches, put in a back stitch, unless you really need that seam to be secure. In which case I do a back stitch all the way. All right, I think that's good. And then what you have, it looks almost like it was sewn on the machine if you're even enough. And then to finish it off, you can either, again, make a few passes over each other or knot it off. I like knotting it off because it's faster. Sometimes I have gone too far and I do not have enough thread to knot it off, in which case I do the few passes and call it good. So there's the nice pretty side, and there is the back side, and that is a back stitch. Next, we're going to do an invisible stitch. This works best when you're joining two layers together, such as doing a arm cuff, doing a cuff, or if you're putting the lining to the shell. And so I'm going to show what it looks like as a cuff. So I've got a cuff to my cuff. Here's the shell, here's the lining. You can do doubled over if you want to on the thread, which is you take the thread and you knot the two ends together instead of having one end loose. I generally only do that for sewing on buttons because it makes button sewing twice as fast. And sadly, I do not. Oh, I do have buttons here somewhere. I might be able to do a button. I've got a trick to make sewing on multiple buttons much faster. All right, so I'm going to put you together like this. So you're going to take your needle and you're going to come up in the channel that's created by this fold. And you're going to come up through. And you're going to go through here. And even though it's knotted, I go back around on this first one to make it extra secure. So you're going to do like with the straight stitch, you're going to go 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch, pull through, and then I flip it, go back. And you want to make sure that you are at the top of the fold. Unless there is a bit of a gap, sometimes garments will sit, the lining will sit 1/2 inch to 1 inch inside of the shell, like that. In which case you want to go from the top to the side, but we're going to go the easy way and do top to top. And I will show you the indented one later. So you take your needle, go through the top of the fold and back, and pull through. And you've got a nice little join there, and you can barely see the thread. If it's matching thread, you won't see it at all. All right, and this is the only one, except for the end. The beginning and the end, you loop around like that. Otherwise, what you're going to do is you're going to alternate sides and make sure the thread is going in, lined up with where it came out. Otherwise, it's going to pull funny. This is also called a tunnel stitch. Look at that, nice, beautiful. You can't see the stitching at all. This is a little slower than some of the other stitches because you do have to be pretty precise. All right, so now we're going to transition and I'm going to show you how to do the indented, where the lining and the shell do not match up perfectly at the edges, and the lining sits a little bit inside. So I've just gone through, comes down like this. So you've got 2 layers here. You want to make sure you're only going through the one layer, otherwise your stitching is going to show on the other side. See how my needle's not seen? You can't see my needle there. If you can't see the needle, you're not going to see the stitch. And just like before, you pull it through. The hardest part with this is keeping the edge even, which is why I pin usually before I do it. I don't pin often, but when I do, it's very necessary. And then you just keep going. As you can see, you cannot see the stitching. So to finish this off, instead of going ahead, you go back around. Pull through, and you're going to go between the 2 layers, bring up, catch that thread. You do not want to catch the fibers of the fabric, because if that pulls wrong, it's going to weaken the fabric. And if you have to rip it out, you might accidentally rip the fabric and get a huge hole. And just like before, wrap around 4 or 5 times, pull, bury the tail. You go between the 2 layers, come out on the lining side usually, pull through, pull it a little tight, snip, and then the tail disappears into the lining. And that is the invisible or tunnel stitch. Great for connecting the lining to the shell. Whip stitch is the next one. This one is also it's a pretty secure stitch if you go small enough. This is one I would probably use the doubled thread with both ends knotted together. So what you're going to do is you're going to come up, and this one, you're not going to have a big seam allowance. It's only going to be like a 1/16 or an 1/8 of an inch. Come up through. And I would do one just to be secure. And then you're going to come down 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch. Pull through. So you've got a nice little diagonal there. Try to keep your stitches even. If you have to draw on your stitching line, there's no shame in it. I do it all the time. Another trick to get your stitches even, not the seam allowance, but the stitches themselves, you can take a Sharpie and mark the 1/8, 1/4, and 1/2 inch on the side of your thumb. I know people who get that tattooed on their thumb because they use it so much. but it's a handy little trick to get your stitches the same length, because you're going to have your thumb right there anyway. So it makes a nice little guide to make sure your stitches are the same length. In period, they were not necessarily the same length.
Shauna, when would you use a whip stitch?
They would use the whip stitches on side seams because it is a very secure stitch. So anywhere that there's going to be pressure, you can use a whip stitch. And I'll show you why here in a sec. So I pull it apart, and if it's pulled tight, you're not going to see the stitching. It's not going to pull, but I've got to pull it tight. So the back looks kind of like that. The front, however, is nice and secure. So when they use this, corseters, the people who made stays and bodies would have the front and the back pieces already cut and assembled. And when a customer came in, they would fit it on, figure out where the seam needed to be, and then they would whip stitch the seam together for a more custom fit, because you didn't need that much seam allowance on it. So this was used on corsets and bodies and stays. But that's pretty secure. And then to finish it off, same as with the others, you come up right here. Go through just the thread and catch just the thread, wrap around, pull and snip. And then again, you can also do the, if it doesn't pull tight like this one did not, you can just do multiple passes and it'll hold just fine. I'm just paranoid and like to knot stuff. But that is a very secure seam. You do not necessarily want to use it on fabrics that shreds, such as linen, unless it's a very thickly compact woven linen like the canvas. But lighter linen is going to shred. And then the last one I have is the hem stitch. These are just the ones I could think of off the top of my head. If there's another stitch that you would like to see, let me know, and I'll see if I can remember how to do it, because I know I've forgotten some. So the hem stitch is best for skirts and pant legs. And it's going to be the single width of thread. You get your hem, fold it up. This one actually goes backwards from the other stitches. So you're going to start the opposite side that you normally start on. Bring your needle up through the fold so that the tail is hidden. You're going to take about eighth to a quarter of inch over. You're going to take a very small bite of the outer fabric. And notice the needle is going from left to right, opposite of what you would normally do. So the sharp point is towards where I began. So we're going to pull it. And then we're going to come around. We're going to go a little bit over. We're going to take a wider stitch, about a quarter of an inch or so. Make sure you do not catch the outer layer on this one. You're going to pull and see how it's got a little cross? The reason for this stitch is it allows the skirt or the pant hem to flow the way it's supposed to. It's not very constrictive. It's not very visible. And then you're going to come over a little bit, take a little bite. Only 1 or 2 threads really is all you should be catching. And you want to keep the stitch that's wider on the inside about 1/8 of an inch from the fold. And the little bite that you're taking is just above the fold. Otherwise, it's gonna roll funky. That could have been wider. It's been a while since I've used this stitch. I usually have very nice even stitches, but I'm a little out of practice on this one, as my struggles will show you. Ideally, your hem is either pinned in place or has been ironed so that it lays and you're not struggling with it like I am. But you've got those nice little crosses. The points are close enough together that no toes are going to get caught in there and catch it and rip it. But at the same time, it's kind of like a stretch stitch that you use for knit clothing so that the fabric can move and it's not bound up. And yeah, you just keep going until you're done. And the way that I finish this one off, again, you can do the multiple passes, or what I do is I do 1 pass down here on the bottom. So you've got your line and then 1 across. I catch that loop that I just made, pull tight, and wrap around. And then again, to bury the tail, you put as close to the knot as you can. Go through, make sure you're not going through the outer layer. Pull until it's a little gappy, because then the finished tail gets sucked in. So that's what it looks like on the outside. Let me see if I can get, there we go. Little bites. If it's the same color thread, you wouldn't even notice it. All right, I'm sure I'm missing some stitches. Were there any? I'm not sure how to do a herringbone stitch because I don't use it very often.
Shauna, what's the difference between a whip stitch and a blanket stitch?
Blanket stitches are usually done on the edge of just one piece. Someone showed me how to do it forever ago and I never use it. So I forgot how to do it. I've forgotten how to do so many stitches because I just don't use them. But it's usually to help keep the edge from fraying. It's not quite as secure as a whip stitch, which is part of why I don't use it very often. But it's mostly to help keep the edges from fraying.
Okay, since we have the time, if anyone has any specific questions and you want to unmute and we can have a conversation, that would be wonderful. Okay, we have a question. how do you recommend sewing in a straight line? How do you recommend keeping a nice straight line?
I usually draw on my stitching line. That's the easiest way to do it, in all honesty. When you're doing something like princess seam, it's a little bit harder because generally you match up the edges. Well, with a princess seam, you've got a curve going to a straight line, or if you have an opposite curve going to an opposite curve, that can make things interesting. Sorry, I've got a train going by. But yeah, I usually just draw on my seam allowance, my stitch lines. Sorry, I've got to mute myself. It's getting pretty close. If I had the money, I would also get the tattoo.
I guess a Sharpie would work for a temporary one.
Yeah, a fine tip Sharpie is great for it. Just make sure it's a fine tip and not a broad tip, because otherwise your line's just, it's too wide and it's like, do I go to the center? Do I go to one of the sides? If you can't draw on your seam allowance, I mean, the best thing you can do is eyeball it. Because that's all that I did here was I eyeballed it. And that's pretty even. Generally, when I draft my own patterns, if it's something where it has to be absolutely perfectly lined up, when I print my patterns, I do not put seam allowance on them. And then what I'll do is I'll put the pattern piece down, draw it on, trace around it, and that's my stitch line. And then I'll go around with a ruler and add the seam allowance.
Oh, good idea. You mentioned before that you might have a button that you could show.
Yes. Let me see if I can find, I might have taken them all to the office. I'm still in the process of moving everything from my home to my office. Aha, I do have some buttons. They're not the pretty ones, but they will work. All right, so whether you have a shank button or a no shank button, I have a handy trick for sewing on multiple buttons. Oh, it's a bag that's in a bag. Okay. So first thing is I'm going to get a fresh piece of thread because these are a little short for what I need to do. Just pull it right off. Thread your needle. So I don't think I showed how I knotted the string. This works if you're doing a single thread or a double thread. You pinch the ends between your finger and thumb, wrap around, and then just roll it off of your finger. And it makes a nice little messy knot. You don't have to cut the tail off unless it's extremely long, because more than likely it's going to get hidden anyway. They're not going to see it. Okay, so normally when you sew on a button, you want to do about 10 passes. If you double the thread, you've only got to do 5. So let's take this one. You come up from behind. I'm assuming most people know the basics of sewing a button, so I'm not going to explain too much. You do your passes. I'm only going to do one for the sake of speed. All right, your button is secure. You come back through. Instead of tying off, you go back down between your layers, pass your needle between the layers, and come back up where the next button needs to go, the center point of where the button needs to go. And this way, you're not tying off and you're not starting a new one. And the passes are generally enough that if one falls off, you don't have to worry about the others falling off, because you should have the equivalent of 10 passes, which is essentially knotting itself. So you just do them in a chain. And look there, 2 buttons. You pass through. I've done the 5 passes buffet. You go between the layers. I usually mark with a fabric marker, with a fabric pen, where they need to go beforehand, because I've measured it out and figured it all out. Pass up between. And put on your new button. This is actually something I learned from the bridal industry. Do your 5 passes. Go through. And we'll say I've gotten all of the buttons. So let me do a couple more passes so it's a little more secure for tying off. Once you've gotten all the buttons on, or you've reached as far as you can with your piece of thread, you tie off. You just go through the mass of threads, wrap around, pull through, and again, going as close to the knot as possible, you bury the tail. Go so it's a little gappy, that way when you pull taut, the thread gets sucked in. And you've just sewed however many buttons in like half an hour. Because I had a cotardie with 43 buttons. And I got that done in like half an hour, 45 minutes by using this method. So that is how you do buttons in a chain.
I have a question for you, Shauna.
Mm-hmm.
What do you suggest for needle sizes for either heavier, medium weight fabric for button holding, the needles, any special kind of millinery, old style English needles?
So I just use the sharps that you can get at the fabric store.
Okay.
I generally, the narrower and sharper the needle is, the easier it's going to pass through fabrics. You definitely want to use those narrow needles on the finer fabrics and heavier needles on heavier fabrics.
Sharp points are better than the ball points, correct?
Ball points are for a specific fabric, and I can't remember which one it is. But yeah, sharp points go between the threads, the fibers in the fabric better.
Ball points work well on stretch fabrics because you're actually pushing
That's what I think. Yeah.
the knit aside rather than piercing through it.
Yeah. Yeah, and I don't generally work with knits, so. I work mostly with woven fabrics, so I don't really use ball points. I'll use a leather needle every now and then when I'm working with pleathers, but that's about it. Any other questions?
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned, Trina mentioned buttonholes. Do you do those by hand or you do them by machine?
If I have a lot of them, I do them by machine because it's just faster.
Well,
But I can show you how to do it, but I do not have my awl with me. So unfortunately, I can't. My awl is at my office, I think. I might have one here still. My good awl is at my office. But again, my work area is kind of a mess because that's where we stored everything from the vacuum remodel. I can see it. I see it. I can't reach it. See if I can get to it. Generally speaking, some people, there, I got it. Some people will pierce all of their buttonholes at the same time. I do them one at a time because they're just going to close up on you. So here I have my awl. For those of you who have never hand sewn a buttonhole, what an awl does is it pushes the fibers aside so that you're not cutting anything. The fabric maintains. Oh, this is for eyelets, not buttonholes. Oh my God, what am I thinking? Scratch that. This is for eyelets, which you can also use for lacing. Hand sewn eyelets stand up very well because you're not cutting anything, so you're not losing the integrity of the fabric. For buttonholes, you want a thicker thread than this. They make specific button fabric, button thread. You want to use that. So you come up from the back side and you're going to do a straight stitch. And I don't really use them much, but I know how to do them because they're very similar to eyelets. And you're going to go in the shape of your buttonhole. Different periods use different shapes. So if you're going for historical accuracy, that is something you'll need to research. See if that's long enough. And then you're going to do the bar tack across. And that you want to do, if it's on the front edge of the buttonhole where all the pressure is going to be, you want to do a few passes on that because that's going to be under a lot of pressure. And with buttonholes, you do cut the fabric. So there will be some integrity lost because you're cutting the fabric. For demonstration purposes, I'm only going to do 2. Come up. And the reason you're doing this is because it's a lot easier to line up the next set of stitches if you've got a guide. So this stitch is a guide. You can also double over your thread so that it goes a little bit quicker. And it'll make the buttonhole more secure. But I believe in period, they only did one. It was only one thread wide. All right, so we're going to say that's good. So you've got your bar tacks on both ends. You've got your guide, which mine is not straight. So you're going to come up a little bit to the outside. See, I'm not right on the stitch. I'm about, oh, probably 1/8 of an inch. And you're gonna come right to the inside. And you're gonna pull. Then you're gonna come up right next to your previous stitch. And you're gonna go in right next to your previous stitch. And this is why you want to use button thread, because it's thicker. It will not take you as long. This is basically a satin stitch. And you keep going all the way around. I should have my guide threads closer, but it's easier to see if they're wider apart. I'm not going to finish this because it will take way too long. But yeah, basically you do a satin stitch all the way around. The inside between the two sides, in all honesty, should not be any wider than your needle, because you're just going to cut that. You're going to take a seam ripper and cut it open. So that you've got the hole for the button. And the satin stitch around binds the edges and keeps it from fraying. Any other questions? Did folks pre-shrink their fabric? I don't know that there's any proof for that. I would imagine so, because fabric was so hard to make. It was a precious commodity. You would not want to make something, wash it, and have it shrink on you, because then you can't wear it again. But at the same time, there was a lot of linen worn next to the skin, and the outer garments weren't washed the same way as the linens. They had lots of linens that they would change throughout the course of the day. And the reason they did that was because linen wicks moisture away. So the sweat and the oil and the grime get on your linens, your undergarments, and stay off of your nice, pretty fabrics. So they actually didn't wash their outer garments nearly as much unless they got something spilled on it. And even then, they probably just spot cleaned it. Any other questions?
Linen thread, more common than cotton threads historically?
Yes. In Europe, linen thread was more common because cotton wasn't as widely available, and it wasn't quite as sturdy if it was made in Europe. In the Middle East, cotton was very common because that's what they had readily available to them. So it just depends on what region you're in. The wax thread is called silamide. Let me type it in the chat real quick. I can't remember where exactly I got this one, but it's you might be able to find it at a leather store because it does say fur your wax skein. But yeah, I found it online. And it comes in a wide variety of colors. It's usually polyester. You're welcome. All right, we've still got 5 minutes. Any other questions?
Why the wax thread?
So if you do not wax your thread, it's going to tangle up on you. The waxing keeps the thread from tangling on itself.
If you don't buy the wax thread, you can just have a block of beeswax by your sewing station and run the thread
Yep.
across the wax.
I've actually got some here. You can get it at Joann's even. There are people who sell beeswax blocks for that specific purpose. But yeah, if you don't have anyone you can get it from, you can get it at Joann's or Michael's, I think has them too. But any sewing store is going to have something like this.
Would you suggest when you're using the beeswax to cover the lengths of thread and put a little heat on it to melt the wax into it? I've read that somewhere and I don't know if that's okie dokie.
Yes, that is definitely something you want to do, because otherwise the wax is just sitting on top of the thread, and as you work, it comes off. So by adding heat to it, you're pressing it down into the thread.
Thank you, dear.
You're welcome. That's correct. It does not need to be food grade unless you are doing like one of those leather mugs that the stitching is going to be seen inside. Of course, those are usually sealed with something else on the inside too. So I don't know. I don't really do those. So. Any other questions? Of course, it's on there. I think, are the next couple of classes mine as well?
Yes, that's correct. We have
Right.
the we missed the weaving class on Wednesday, so I guess we'll be rescheduling that.
Yeah.
And you're doing, I believe, a corset or bodice class.
I'm doing both,
Okay.
but I can't remember which one comes first. So one is drafting and fitting a bodice, and the way that I do them, you will not need a bra. They are basically a medieval bra, and they hold better than a modern bra. They're more comfortable than a modern bra. I need to make some to wear in my everyday life because I love them so much. And then the other one I'll be talking about corset construction, how to pattern it. We're going to do the effigy corset, the effigy bodies, the effigy stays, whichever one you want to call them, from Queen Elizabeth I. And I'll go through how to pattern it, and then some construction techniques for it.
All right, we have a question. How can we access this recording? On the event page on Facebook where this was advertised, as soon as the recording is ready, I will post the link to the recording. And in a few days, we'll be launching our dedicated YouTube site for Sewing for Renaissance Festivals, and we'll be putting all of the recordings from our classes on our YouTube site as well.
Exciting stuff.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Shauna, for the class, and thank you everyone for participating, and we look forward to seeing you at some future classes.
All right. Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a good evening, everybody.